So this talk is entitled Great Aspectations, Morphological Encoding in Second Language Acquisition. So this is the outline of this particular talk. We'll start with the problem, talk about raising to object and aspect, discuss theories of second language acquisition that compare and contrast with performance or competence accounts, look at a pilot study with raising to object alone, and then the full experiment with morphological and non-morphological aspect, and then return to some discussions and conclusions. So beginning with the problem, this study investigates whether second language learners of English can acquire low-frequency aspectual restrictions, such as John believed Mary to paint a portrait. A sentence like this is bad compared to if you add in an overt aspectual marker have for perfective aspect, you get John believed Mary to have painted a portrait. Now, these two examples differ in regard to whether aspect is morphologically encoded or not morphologically encoded. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move along. So there are contrasting predictions in the literature having to do with aspect. So the bottleneck hypothesis proposed by Slabakova predicts a greater difficulty for morphologically encoded aspect, whereas the representational deficit hypothesis would predict a greater difficulty for non-morphologically encoded aspect. And so the question this experiment sets out to investigate is whether there's a difference between morphologically encoded and non-morphologically encoded aspect. So as to raising it to objects in particular, when believe type verbs, so verbs that behave like believe, take a non-finite complement, it forms the raising to object construction, such as John believed Mary to be intelligent, which we assume that Mary is both gets a theta role in the complement and it gets case in the main clause. These kinds of examples, like 3, are highly infrequent in the input. And it also has aspect restrictions on the non-finite complement. So whereas John believed Mary to be intelligent is fine, notice that John believed Mary to paint a portrait is not. Now, and remember, I had said that if you reintroduce paint with an aspectual marker, you get have painted a portrait, it's much better. Now, these are not exactly like all verbs of this type. It's not like by virtue of being a non-finite complement, it doesn't allow this. A verb like want does allow a non-finite complement that has a verb like paint. Paint is an action, right? A non-stative verb. So we can do wanted to paint a portrait, needed to paint a portrait, and persuaded to paint a portrait. So these restrictions are specific to believe type verbs. There are two types of aspect, non-morphologically encoded aspect, which is situation aspect or lexical aspect, and morphologically encoded aspect or viewpoint aspect, which has to do with morphology or the auxiliary in English most of the time. So non-morphologically encoded aspect has to do with axion start, which has 4 categories of verbs, specifically states, actions, complements, and achievements. And raising to object disallows non-stative, non-finite complements, such as paint, which is an accomplishment. Compare this to know, like John believed Mary to know the answer is a state, comparatively is much better. Morphologically encoded aspect is in English, it's going to be the overt morphemes marking progressive and perfective aspect. Raising to object allows non-stative verbs if they have progressive aspect or perfective aspect overtly marked. So as we said, John believed Mary to paint a portrait doesn't sound good, but John believed Mary to painted a portrait, better. And in fact, John believed Mary to be painting a portrait right now, also better than 11. Now, not all languages have raising to object, such as Spanish does not have raising to object. So the task of an L1 Spanish L2 English learner is to acquire not only raising to object, but its aspect restrictions. So this raises the question of if there's any difficulty, is it a performance problem or a competence problem? So research is divided as to the source of difficulty in acquiring aspect. Some claim performance factors, as Slavakova did, and some claim representational deficits, as Hawkins did. This division makes different predictions for the L2 acquisition of morphologically encoded versus non-morphologically encoded aspect. Morphology mapping approaches, such as the bottleneck hypothesis, claim that performance issues are due to trying to acquire inflectional morphology, that there's a mismatch between their syntactic knowledge and the inflection associated with the same functional head, such as the English TP. So consider that the learner might demonstrate that they have the EPP and they don't use verb raising, but still might struggle with past tense and third person singular, which are reflexes of the agreement with T. Another version of this would be complexity of feature mapping. So this comes from Donna Lardiere's work, where morphemes can map various meanings, like the past tense. So, was can be regular past. It can be polite, marking I was wondering if, or it can be an ambiguous. Jane said Joyce is pregnant, meaning she's pregnant now. And so mapping features to morphology creates added difficulty. So this is another case where overt morphology would be challenging. So, such as John believed Mary had painted a portrait, has many different types of meanings. Performance approaches such as the bottleneck hypothesis predict that L1 Spanish, L2 English learners can have knowledge of the aspect distinctions, and there's added difficulty for distinctions reliant on morphology. Representational deficit hypothesis rather claims that the non-native-like acquisition that we sometimes observe is due to a lack of uninterpretable features in the interlanguage. Specifically, uninterpretable features that are not from the L1 are not available in the L2. So if it's not in your native language, you can't acquire it when you learn a second language. Cross-linguistic differences in aspect of reliance on uninterpretable features. So verb raising in Spanish requires a strong uninterpretable inflection. Whereas non-verb rating in English has a weak version of the inflection feature. The aspectual heads of Spanish would require a strong one. So the question is whether this. So notice that English has weak and strong inflectional marking feature, and Spanish only seems to have the strong. So the question is a weak uninterpretable inflection available for the L1 Spanish speakers in their L2 English? Is it possible for these L1 Spanish speakers to have the weak inflection feature? So competence approaches such as the representational deficit hypothesis predicted L1 Spanish, L2 English learners would have difficulty with distinctions not present in their L1 that rely on uninterpretable features, specifically aspect where L1 is not like their L2. And in fact, greater difficulty is expected for non-morphologically encoded aspects, specifically weak uninterpretable inflectional head. So where that weak head is needed, the Spanish L1 would struggle in their L2 English. So in sum, a greater difficulty for morphological encoded aspect would support a performance approach, and greater difficulty for a non-morphological encoded aspect would support representational deficit approach. So let's look at a pilot study. In this pilot study, there were 13 advanced L1 Spanish, L2 English learners, and 13 monolingual English speakers. They completed an untimed grammaticality judgment task with a 1 to 5 Likert scale, and this is the data that was gathered in that experiment. So these are the results for the pilot study. So here we see a chart with ratings in a native group and an advanced group. These are not near natives, but they are advanced proficiency. We see two different kinds of verbs, two kind of examples with raising to object. In blue, we see examples such as John believes Mary to be intelligent with our stative verb. And in red, we see examples with non-stative verbs like run. John believes Mary to run a mile. And on the left, you can see the native speakers outright rejected the non-statives and more or less accepted the version with the copula. And that's not really what we see for the advanced speakers. So an ANOVA with the factors type and group, in fact, found an effect for both, where the copula for both groups was accepted more than the non-statives. And in fact, the L2 learners had higher ratings overall. There was, in fact, no interaction, but this is due to it being a small number of items. However, it does suggest that the learners have raising to object in their interlanguage. It shows that they have some knowledge of it. And one question based upon this is what would happen if they were near native speakers? So the full experiment, which compared morphological and non-morphological aspect, had 27 late L1 Spanish, L2 English learners, all born in Spanish-speaking countries, arrived in the U.S. after puberty, age of arrival 15 or later. 20 monolingual English speakers were the control group. And learner proficiency was calculated as a composite across two proficiency measures. And the near natives performed within the native range. And then the advanced learners were within 15% below. There was a group of intermediate learners as well, they're 15 to 30% below, and the advanced intermediate group were collapsed because of the small numbers. There were 30 lexicalizations with the raising to object verbs. A baseline condition for each lexicalization was created with a finite complement, such as Leo concluded that Olivia baked the cake. The complements all have with non-stative verbs. Then there's a non-finite verb with a bare aspect, which is to say that it's a non-finite version of 14. Leo concluded Olivia to bake the cake, and then it had the non-finite perfective condition, such as Leo concluded Olivia to have baked the cake. Each participant saw 10 of each lexicalization in the 3 conditions. As part of a Latin square design, critical items are presented as part of a larger experiment, and the total of stimuli, including items, distractors, and fillers, seen by each participant was 146. There was a background questionnaire followed by a timed acceptability judgment task with 7 practice items, the stimuli, followed by the proficiency measures, 2 in English and 1 in Spanish based on the DELE, and then a debriefing questionnaire checking for awareness, but no participant showed evidence of being aware of what they were tested on, so no one was excluded based on this criteria. The monolinguals, here we're going to start with their results. Now, again, the blue is Leo concluded Olivia baked the cake, and it is the most accepted because the finite is the most commonly seen. And then in red, we get the non-finite with the non-stative verb. Leo concluded Olivia to bake the cake, which the monolinguals rejected as expected. And then the green, which is the non-finite, non-stative verb with perfective aspect, was rated more highly as compared to the other non-finite condition, although not as highly as finite. So there is a degradation of the perfective non-finite compared to the finite, but it's certainly better than the bare aspect. If we compare this to the 2 learner groups, we see the near native in the middle and the advanced on the right. If we compare the finite versus the non-finite bare, so blue to red, we see an effect for type where finite was overall more accepted than the bare non-finite. Effect for group, where the natives and near natives behaved the same, but the advanced learners were different from both. And an interaction that suggested the advanced learners had less robust effect for type than the other groups. Now, if we compare the non-finite bare versus the non-finite perfective, red versus green, we also see an effect for type, wherein the perfective was more accepted to the bare. And we see an effect for group, where the advanced, again, were not behaving like the natives and near natives, and an interaction. And this is because there was no difference by type in the advanced group. So, discussions and conclusions. So there was a differential outcome by type of aspect distinction. All groups learned that non-morphologically encoded distinction, which is to say that there was a degradation when there was a non-stative verb and a non-finite complement. But however, the advanced intermediate group did not learn the morphologically encoded distinction, where they did not distinguish between the bare non-finite and the perfective non-finite. The results suggest that morphology is the locus of difficulty for L2 acquisition, which supports the conclusion that mapping of morphology itself presents difficulty. But it's not strictly performance contra the bottleneck hypothesis because it's also detectable in learner knowledge before near native proficiency. It's definitely evidence against the representational deficit hypothesis because because the representational deficit hypothesis suggests that this is not an acquirable distinction whatsoever. And since we found both types of morphological aspect in the near-native speakers, it doesn't support this theory. So both the non-morphologically encoded and morphologically encoded aspect are possible to learn, which suggests that the acquired use of the uninterpretable feature in the interlanguage. So as conclusions, near-native learners did fully learn aspect with raising to object, both non-morphologically coded and morphologically encoded aspect, and therefore full acquisition of aspect is in fact possible near-native proficiency. Thank you.